And to be honest, I know you've done a lot of podcasts and you have a lot of material online in written form and on YouTube everywhere. But I feel like what I want to do with this project in general is to have conversations with experts who are within those fields. And for me, you're an expert in consciousness. I mean, you've thought about this a lot. And what I would like to do is to explore something step by step. And the whole point of this, I guess, is to, for me, it seems like the whole fundamental problem is that we just can't get along with one another. There's so much different theories about what this is and this is. And for me, I just want to like try to unravel it, I guess. So what I'm calling this is, without a name at the moment, is just called unveiling wholeness, which is for me just means how do we understand this whole reality thing. So yeah, I guess I just want to have a step-by-step conversation with you, if that makes sense. I don't know. How do you feel about that?
Oh, that sounds great. I like it. Already, two things come to mind. The first one is you say, you consider me an expert in consciousness, which is I really appreciate that that flattery. But yeah, something that David Pierce says that I really agree with is he says, yeah, I mean, in a lot of fields we can say like, yeah, there's like experts in physics and chemistry and so on, but as far as we're concerned, I think like there's really no experts on consciousness. There's really no authority on consciousness, but yeah, I appreciate the vote of confidence. And yeah, the other thing that came to mind, which is funny, is saying like explore step by step, which seems to both enhance the intelligence of humans and also GPT. So happy to explore that avenue. Yeah.
Okay, well, I guess we'll begin then. So what I'm going to do here, I guess, is just I want this to be like a dialogue where we explore something, explore a question step by step until we truly understand what we mean by each other, and then we can perhaps proceed and let the dialogue naturally unfold.
Perfect.
So I was hoping to begin with the question of what is consciousness, and perhaps we could get the highest level overview of what consciousness is or what we understand consciousness to be, and we can maybe probe into details if we see that it's necessary.
Yeah, yeah. So first of all, there's about like 10 different definitions for the word consciousness. And I do think, yeah, in general, when people are confused about what they're talking about, is because one person is using one definition and somebody else is using a different definition. I would say that every definition is very interesting. So I wouldn't say like, okay, only this one matters, the other ones are like not real, because like every kind of sense for the word consciousness is fascinating and intellectually stimulating. There is like consciousness in the sense of, for example, self-awareness, like the feeling of having a sense of self, being recognizing that you have like a sense of agency in the world. There's also like consciousness in the sense of kind of like social consciousness, which is like, hey, like you're aware of of where you are in the world. So there's like a lot of meanings like that. The one that I find the most interesting and fundamental, and what I focus on, is consciousness in the sense of qualia, meaning the way in which experience feels like. And so the thing that you often say here is, maybe you remember when you were a kid, if you wondered, is the blue that I see the same blue that other people see? And the blueness of blue would be like a facet of consciousness or a property of consciousness. And a lot of people also like kind of like try to say consciousness is kind of like a folk concept. It reduces to other things. Maybe it's just a bunch of algorithms. There's no thing called consciousness. But I do think consciousness is a thing, kind of being meta-contrarian there. And essentially there is something that essentially a way in which I can justify this fairly easily. And that is that, yes, there is, for example, the way colors present themselves. There's also the the way in which sound presents itself, and so on. What makes all of those part of consciousness is that they can all be part of a unified experience, right? So color qualia, audio qualia, tactile sensations, they have a property in common, which I would say is the property of consciousness. And the reason they have this property in common is because they can all of them be part of the same experience on a particular moment in time. And so they have something that they have in common. And in that sense, I wouldn't try to reduce it and say, well, there's nothing really that is consciousness, because yeah, clearly all of these properties share a fundamental property.
Could I perhaps take a step back? And I think the question boils down to, is consciousness fundamental or is matter fundamental? Does consciousness arise from matter, or does consciousness give rise to matter? Could we perhaps explore that question?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a lot of people realize like Descartes, like I think therefore I am. Maybe thinking is already kind of like you're assuming too much, because you can actually have a lot of experiences that don't involve thinking. You can perhaps even say something like, I experience, therefore I am. But then also,
But that's just thinking.
Yeah, you could say that. You could say that. But then also you could say like, well, even the concept of I is kind of like maybe kind of ill-defined. Really, all you can ultimately say is there is an experience, and that is kind of like the thing you can your reality ultimately boils down to is like, hey, there's experiences. And so I think like if you're like a radical skeptic in a sense, at the very least you must admit that there are experiences, and anything else you may arrive at is kind of an inference based on looking at a lot of experiences and trying to figure out what is beneath them, or what explains them, what strings them together. So in that sense, I think the position that, hey, reality is actually fundamentally in line of something like consciousness, like maybe that is what's fundamental, makes a lot of sense, because you've never experienced anything that isn't consciousness. So I think I'm very, very sympathetic to kind of like any project that tries to make sense of all of reality in terms of consciousness, because using something like matter as kind of like the base reality, well, you're kind of like skipping what you actually do have access to, what you actually do know is real for sure, which is your own experience. And yes, in the sort of like models that we explore at Qualia Research, essentially we explore kind of like formal ways of describing what's called idealism, which is the idea that yes, actually what truly exists is consciousness, is qualia, and physics is actually describing the behavior of consciousness, is describing the behavior of sensations. In the sense like, hey, physics is absolutely very true in the sense that it's actually capable of describing the behavior of things. But what it's ultimately describing is the behavior of experiences, behavior of qualia. So within this perspective, essentially, the entire universe would actually be a gigantic field of consciousness. And we are like little parts of that gigantic field. But that field actually does behave according to the laws of physics. So yes, from that whole perspective, that whole argument, consciousness would be fundamental, and matter would actually just be kind of an emergent property within a field of consciousness.
So you mentioned the word experiences. I would like us to define what we mean by experiences, because there's thinking, there's feeling, there's perceptions. What do you mean by experiences?
It's actually extremely broad in its scope.
What did you mean when you used that word, perhaps?
So, I mean, right now, you're having an experience. I do not mean just in the sense of thinking. I do not mean either in the sense of perception, in the sense of like having to perceive an outside world or interacting with an outside world. And we can kind of like arrive at, what do we mean by experiences by looking at a lot of cases, I think. So one example is dreaming. I mean, I would definitely say that dreams are experiences, even though a lot of dreams actually are very thin in cognition, right? Like they're kind of like self-reflective awareness, or cognitive component of a dream can at times be very thin. Like there might not be a lot going on in there. But you may have like a very rich quality of experience with a lot of emotions, a lot of feelings. And also clearly with dreaming, you're not actually perceiving the world, right? Like also perception has a bunch of senses. There's one sense in which, you refer to it as actually interacting with an external world. Whereas there's other senses, which is like interacting with your a simulation of a world, in which case, yeah, okay, sure, within dreaming, you are perceiving. And then there are like cases such as like, psychedelic states of consciousness, where you could say, well, you're modifying the way in which you're representing the world. Like maybe you were representing a particular wall with a certain texture and colors, and on a psychedelic, it might be like more intensified colors, different texture, which, yeah, sort of like indicates that, the mapping between the external world and the quality of your experience is variable. So anything that you can reference within kind of like the sensations that are arising, I would classify as part of your experience. It's actually quite difficult to define from the bottom up, for the simple reason that it's really kind of like a primitive, semantic primitive. I don't think if you don't have kind of like the ability to turn your awareness onto the concept of qualia within you, it might be really hard to point it. And I actually know a couple of people who, like, I'm kind of skeptical they even have like an internal sense of what an experience is or what qualia is, despite like talking to them for hours. So there might be, yeah, kind of like a potentially some kind of like innate semantic referent that yeah, you need to kind of like join the conversation in a way.
Mm-hmm. And this may seem like a silly question, but I feel like it is worthwhile to explore. Why do we need to think about consciousness? Why do we need to study consciousness? Why are we even having this conversation in the first place? What makes us interested in learning about consciousness? Why does it even matter?
Yeah, the ultimate justification, as far as I'm concerned, is that consciousness is the seat of value. So essentially, okay, like two camps, you can either say, okay, there's no value, there's no meaning, there's no reason to exist, or to not exist, kind of like nihilism. But if you actually do, have like some notion of like, no, actually there is something valuable in all of the universe, in all of existence. There's something, a reason to be alive or a reason to not be alive if it's this valuable. Then you must ask the question, okay, like, what is value? Where does it manifest? And how can we increase it? Or how can we prevent it from getting destroyed? And I think if you really look carefully at the question of like, what is value? You will go through several stages where, like, first, you may think that value is something that has to do with the state of the world. Like, let's say, a very shallow notion of value is something like, well, to be very rich or be very popular or something like that. And if you think that way, you may think, well, value is located in the physical world. It has to do with, the configurations of matter and energy outside of you. But then you can reason, well, imagine a world where those configurations were there, but there was nobody to perceive them. There was nobody that were actually experiencing them. We were all, our experiences are completely different than whatever is happening in the world. Would it still be valuable? And I think with that kind of like thought experiment, you realize, hey, hold on a second. The moment value actually gets cashed in, the moment value actually gets realized is when it affects experiences. Even the kind of like the sense of meaning, like, hey, somebody might say like, oh, I don't want a pleasant life. I want a very meaningful life. If you really introspect, you look at it very, very, very objectively, very, very carefully, you will realize that very quote unquote meaningful states of consciousness are actually those where every moment contains like tiny pleasant sensations. Like a very meaningful experience is actually one that contains a lot of micro pleasures along it. And so as you kind of like start, investigating further and further, eventually you arrive at the conclusion that value manifests as states of consciousness. And so investigating consciousness is ultimately investigating what makes the universe and life worthwhile in any way whatsoever. And so for me, it's actually not just a interesting or a important question. For me, it's, hey, this is where the actual value in the universe is located. It's the most important question.
And I like to bring it down because to the practical level. For example, like if we walk around the world, if we look at the news, if we look at the media, there's quite a lot of disorder. You know, we're destroying the planet in ways. We're killing each other. There's war. There's suffering. There's inequality. There's fear. There's anxiety. There's guilt. There's all these things. And I think fundamentally, are we looking just for this sense of, like you said, this sense of pleasure, this sense of happiness, joy, peace, whatever word you want to use? Is that the ultimate thing that we're looking for?
Yes, yes. Most people may not realize it or may not admit it to themselves. Um, there's quite a lot of reasons why, and it has to do with social signaling. So essentially, um, we essentially evolved to be like social tribal animals. So essentially, if people believe that you're kind of like overly concerned with your own pleasure or something like that, they may not think of you as a good ally or as a good partner. They may think of you as kind of selfish. So actually, we look for friends, and family and potential mates who are tie in their valence, tie in their sense of well-being with what goes on in the world and what goes on with other people. And so it's very paradoxical in a sense and kind of self-contradictory. That's the human condition. But essentially, yeah, if we look at somebody having like very, very unapologetically amazing pleasure, even when the world around it is kind of like getting breaking up, we may actually have kind of a disgust reaction towards that kind of person. We may think, well, they're like selfish or self-absorbed or in their own world or something like that. But if you think about it, that's actually a misrepresentation, right? Like in terms of the qualia, in terms of what's actually going on in that person, they're having a good time. It's just that once you kind of like read or interpret that within the tribal social cognition operating system of humans, then that comes out as like, oh, pretty negative. But no, I mean, ultimately though, once you kind of like iron out all of these internal contradictions and like edge cases, ultimately, when it comes down to it, yes, actually, that is what we're looking for. We're looking for well-being in ourselves and others. And yes, to the extent that we have empathy, either emotional or cognitive with non-human animals, we also care about them, of course. But ultimately, yes, it cashes down on looking for good feelings, avoiding bad feelings.
Right. And could we see, to me, I think the reason why it's worthwhile to investigate consciousness, to explore consciousness, is to exactly what you just said, to find out what that sense of peace, of happiness, joy is, and also to discover what is intelligence, what is creativity.
Yes.
Where do ideas come from? Where do thoughts come from? And what are thoughts in the first place? And yeah, what do you think about that? So to find out what is intelligence, to find out what is love, and to discover that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say in how I think of it, intelligence would be what it would be called an instrumental value. Like intelligence is not inherently good, but it's like such a powerful enabler for everything else that is good or might be good if it's pointed in the right direction, that essentially it makes a lot of sense to spend a lot of time figuring out actually what is intelligence, how do we increase it, at least in us humans, in terms of our own kind of like conscious intelligence. And very, very interestingly, consciousness is really significant for intelligence. Essentially, in our models, the very reason why we are conscious, why we evolved to be conscious and inhabit these very, fascinating experiences with a lot of parameters, is because actually being conscious provides what would be called a computational advantage. It's actually doing something, and it's useful for the organism to be conscious. And so any good model of consciousness ultimately, yes, would actually give you two things. I mean, one, it would allow you to explain when an experience feels good or bad and why. And also, it would tell you in what ways experiences are actually playing a functional computational role. So absolutely, just kind of restating what you said, kind of like from our point of view.
And another question popped up is, if we take matter, for example, like we have the, atoms, and we can go lower and lower and lower and lower until eventually we meet quarks, but it's not the case that it's mostly just empty space. So what is that space?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so here's a kind of a hopefully a helpful analogy with like history of science and philosophy of science, because in the 19th century people were trying to make sense of electricity, and magnetism. And essentially every model back then essentially assumed a universe that was made of something like, matter and forces, particles and forces. And yeah, like that kind of model had been very, very successful. You could model the elliptical orbits of planets using, particles and forces and Newtonian mechanics. And a lot of physicists and chemists were kind of like, hey, can we apply that to try to make sense of, electricity, or like whatever is happening in in the lab of Faraday, kind of like all of these like strange curves and induction, and the answer was like, no. If you think of the universe as made of atoms and forces, you cannot explain what goes on in electromagnetism. So it actually took kind of like a fundamental ontology shift. I mean, it sounds very esoteric or new age, but no, that's actually what happened in science. They had to realize that a model made of atoms and forces was not going to take us anywhere. And instead, they postulated a model based of fields and differential equations, where essentially you have kind of this smooth surface that can get stressed or tensed up. And essentially, according to some differential equations, you can show how kind of like that tension propagates across space and time. And that kind of model is actually able to explain the electromagnetic phenomena. Ultimately, that led to Maxwell's equations. So if you look at the universe now from that lens, from the lens of a field, actually atoms, they're really a field manifestation. When you have an electron, from the point of view of the field, that really is just kind of like a place where the field lines converge. But really the thing that is real, would be the field, including the field lines. The atom is kind of like almost kind of like a residue, or like kind of like an emergent effect of the field. Maybe you can think of it as kind of the the foam in a seashore. Really what's real is actually the water. The foam is just like a little bit of kind of like an after effect that happens because of it. I mean, likewise, yeah, from this perspective, it's not like empty space. It really is actually what reality is made of, and the bulk of it. And yeah, I mean, if you go deeper into into quantum mechanics, in quantum theory, quantum field theory, the quantum void is actually huge, like entirely filled with energy, a huge amount of energy. I mean, it's not just a little bit of energy; it's a huge amount of energy. So yeah, empty space, it's not really empty. It's more kind of the fabric of reality. It's a field, and it's perfectly real. You could even say it's more real than the atoms, actually.
And is that empty space a field? But what other words could we use? The word consciousness for that empty space, or would that be the wrong word to use?
So in our model, at least, yes, the fields of physics, which would be the empty space, is actually a field of consciousness. So yeah, it doesn't mean that it's, I mean, it's an important distinction, because like, it doesn't mean that it's a mind. I don't think the field around us is kind of like a super intelligence. It's not like thinking, cogitating. It doesn't have a sense of self or a world model. But I do think it's a gigantic experience. And it's probably, a lot of it is probably really intense and very, very, very real. I mean, like, it's the sort of thing that like, maybe it's pointed at or hinted at by mystical experiences, like some strange substances like 5-MeO DMT. people say like, yeah, you kind of like merge with a universal field of consciousness. It might as well be, yeah, actually the the vacuum of space you're becoming one with, potentially. I mean, there might be ways of justifying kind of like that very very strange claim, but essentially, yes, it would be like a gigantic experience, even though it's not a mind as such.
So what is a mind?
Yeah, mind would be a much more sophisticated type of experience that has a lot of other properties, such as working memory, a sense of self, emotions, semantic content. So, the experiences that we have on, everyday life are really specific experiences that are processing information in a very efficient and coherent way. Whereas if you were to sample, a random experience of all possible experiences, it would look very different than the sort of experiences that we have on an everyday life. And so to be a mind, you actually require a lot of kind of a coherence, a lot of features that allow you to take in information and process it and learn from it, and communicate with others. So yeah, minds are like very, very, very specific types of clusters of experiences.
But what exactly is a mind? Like, to me, a mind is thoughts, feelings, and it's just a bundle of them. And is that what we derive our sense of self from thinking?
So, well, ultimately, I think like, yeah, mind might be a bit of a folk concept. What we can point to is kind of like the coherent and recursive information properties of human experiences, and say like, okay, there's like something very unique going on here, and it's definitely more than just kind of like thoughts and feelings, because I'm pretty sure you could create experiences that have thoughts, but they're still quote unquote psychotic, or like they still don't make sense. They can't reference each other.
But
And likewise,
that's still thoughts, right? Those experiences would still be thoughts.
Yeah, you could say that. Yeah, you could have like thoughts. You can have thoughts without the thoughts being part of a mind. That would be my claim. That a mind is more specific, more specific and more complex. Like, for example, like, yeah, think of it this way. Like, if you're like really sleepy, or like you just got like sedated for like a surgical process or something like that, you may have like a recurring thought, and it may be like completely psychotic or nonsensical. I mean, something along the lines of like, oh, like colorless green ideas, sleep furiously type thing. Like, yeah, you may have that thought, but at the same time, you may have like no working memory. So like, for example, you may be like repeating that thought over and over and over without ever realizing you already had that thought, or like not realizing it doesn't make sense. It doesn't apply to any real world. Whereas I would say like, yeah, a mind in kind of like its full display would be, well, if you're having a thought, you also have an appropriate emotion with it, and you also have a working memory spot where you're keeping that thought, and you can compare and contrast it with other thoughts in other working memory slots, and also you have a field of perception to which the thoughts refer to, and all of those things are very specific, right? You do need a lot of wiring. You do need a lot of kind of a training and specificity to get that type of experience. And in general, if you're just sampling from experiences, they're not going to be like that. They might be much more like just an incoherent thought repeating over and over without any kind of a self-reflectivity or way of of realizing it's incoherent.
Right. Okay, so I'm listening to you, and as a human being, for me, it seems like it's necessary for us to find out what this, going back to our previous point, it's necessary to find out what this thing called happiness, joy piece is. So how does that help us to discover that?
Yeah, well, I mean, realizing that happiness and joy and well-being are states of consciousness is definitely the first step. And then the question that follows is, what qualities of the experience define or like um, make an experience positive or negative. And there's like a lot of like thinking in here. Most of it, I think it's a little bit wrong-headed. So a lot of people think of, for example, happiness in terms of reinforcement learning. That hey, whatever your brain reinforces, we will say that we like it. Just for simple simple algorithmic reasons. It's kind of like your brain is reinforcing that, is asking you to kind of like look for more of it, and maybe we can just define to like something as wanting more of it. That doesn't really work, because a lot of the things that we actually enjoy and we feel really good about don't cause reinforcement and don't makes us want it compulsively. Now, a lot of the things we do enjoy actually do makes us compulsively seek more of it, but a lot of it not. Another kind of like approach is to think of happiness and suffering in terms of neurotransmitters. I mean, a lot of people think, well, serotonin is the happiness molecule or something like that, or dopamine, or actually, I think like probably the better case would be something like opioids would be, or endogenous opioids would be kind of the happiness molecule. But that's not true either, because actually you can inject morphine in a lot of parts of the brain without that feeling good. And actually, most of the regions of the brain don't feel good if you inject it with morphine. It has to be very, very specific parts of the brain. So then you go to kind of like explanations like, oh, maybe there's like regions of the brain that are the ones that cause pleasure and pain. And very famously, there is the pleasure centers and the limbic system, where, yeah, essentially microelectrode studies show that, yeah, if you stimulate some parts of the pleasure centers, you can experience this like profound sense of well-being, or at least like profound sense of anticipation or anticipated pleasure. But then just because you're calling something the pleasure centers, it doesn't mean you have an explanation. So the way we approach it at Qualia Research is completely different than any of these approaches. Essentially, what we claim is that the thing that makes an experience feel good or bad is its structure, like its actual shape. This is an insight from Mike Johnson, one of the co-founders of the organization. And the overall idea is called valence structuralism. So valence means pleasure and pain, whether an experience feels good or bad. Structuralism means, in this context, that the thing that makes it feel good or bad is like the shape. It's the actual, the way the sensations are interrelated with each other. And essentially, what we have found with this investigation, and there's like a lot of kind of like threads that converge in this, is that the thing that makes an experience feel good or bad is how smooth and symmetrical its shape is. And so like, this is most obvious in like the very, very blissful experiences, very, very pleasant experiences, where, for example, even your sense of a body or your sense of space can become so smooth and so symmetric that you can, for example, merge with space. You have the feeling of merging with space. There's an entire realm of consciousness called the sphere of boundless space. Is when an advanced meditation state, extremely smooth and extremely symmetrical, and it's extremely pleasant. On the opposite extreme, we claim that essentially very unpleasant sensations, all of them have this property of being spiky, being asymmetrical or dissonant, which is, yeah, kind of the extreme opposite of symmetry. So that's essentially what we claim. We are definitely rare in this domain. Like most neuroscientists or most people, in academia do not think like this, but that's essentially what we're, working on. one of the things that makes the Institute special in a way.
And may I ask, what is the motivation for doing the work that you do?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's huge reasons, but going back to, hey, the seed of value is states of consciousness. Essentially, once you have this kind of lens, the ethical priorities may actually shift quite significantly on several fronts. But essentially, it allows us to identify where we should essentially apply kind of humanitarian relief in what is the worst suffering and what can we do about it. But then the other thing is there's also like very practical applications to the research that we're doing. For those who are curious, we have a video on our YouTube channel called Exploratory Haptic Research at QRI. And it's like just one example, like a very applied, a very applied kind of like outcome of this research, where essentially you can induce very pleasant and wholesome and healing experiences using body vibration. And essentially the kind of body vibration that feels good is precisely that which we predict would feel good. Essentially are particular kinds of vibration that have these like property of consonance and smooth geometry and regularity. All of those feel really good. And yeah, essentially the kinds of body vibration that feel bad are dissonant and spiky and irregular. You know, and these may have like therapeutic applications, like for example, canceling out or covering or smoothing out particular kinds of pain or unpleasant sensations, or, you know, depression, anxiety. You know, nowadays, you know, the way anxiety is treated or depression is treated, you know, besides therapy or, you know, cognitive behavioral therapy, an antidepressant or something like that, is kind of like very chemically driven. You know, people think of like, oh, this is the anxiety molecule, let's give an antagonist to it, or like, let's boost your serotonin. At Qualia Research, we have just a completely different way of looking at it. We think, no, actually, those molecules are modulating patterns, you know, patterns of vibration. But actually, the things that feel good or bad are those patterns of vibration. So we can skip the middleman and just go directly to those patterns. And it's just much more effective and, in principle, way fewer side effects as well.
All right, just for me to be clear on this, let's just say you finish your research, you finish everything you want to do. Finito. What's the final product?
So much. Okay, so I mean, it would be like a list of quite a few. I could highlight some of the most significant ones, perhaps. So first of all, no more intense suffering. So that would be like a huge outcome. So one of the things we do is identify, causes of extreme suffering and how to prevent them. So for example, one of the worst kinds of suffering there is out there is called cluster headaches. They're like a particularly bad headache. I mean, if I say headache, it doesn't sound that bad, but just to contextualize those for those who have no idea what I'm talking about, there's like this scale of pain called the McGill Pain Index. It goes from 0 to 50, and you know, something like a bruising or you know, like a headache, maybe kind of like go to like 10 out of 50 or something like that. Whereas like, let's say something like a broken bone, you know, maybe goes to like 25 or something like that. Amputation, you know, like literally cutting, you know, your finger or something like that, goes all the way to like 38, which is very significant, right? Like the pain of like amputation without anesthesia is like very strong pain. Well, a cluster headache goes all the way to 44. So like people who have cluster headaches is a pain much worse than amputation. And they may typically have something like 100 of those every year. And for most people, they have no idea that it can be cured. And it's a huge problem. And it's, you know, this is like 1 in 1,000 people. So there's like millions of people in the world who suffer from this. And it turns out that DMT, the hallucinogen, which is found in ayahuasca, actually prevents and aborts this headache. So like if you're starting to have one of these headaches and you vaporize a little bit of DMT, within 10 seconds, the headache may go from, you know, 10 out of 10 pain to maybe like 1 out of 10 pain or 0 out of 10 pain. But nobody's actually pushing legislation or, you know, kind of like doing specific research. There's a few groups where like, it's just such a tiny amount of people who are kind of like, hey, this is important, and trying to push it forward. And I think the reason is, well, besides the stigmatization of psychedelics and their legal status, it is also that it's invisible. Like we don't have a conceptual framework or way of looking at the world that highlights cluster headaches as one of the most pressing, humanitarian problems out there. But once you have a consciousness lens or a consciousness focus, then, oh my gosh, like this is such an important topic. And the same is for like a couple of other things, like chronic pain is another example. Chronic pain is also like way more common than we realize. There's about like 20% of people have chronic pain, and 7% of people have like severe chronic pain. I mean, essentially pain that doesn't allow them to do normal activities, that can't be employed, usually are in bed all day, every day. And essentially people like that usually need high doses of opioids in order to actually be able to function. The problem though is that you quickly get a tolerance to them. And so the problem of tolerance all of a sudden becomes like from our point of view, a humanitarian crisis. And it turns out there's ways of actually reversing opioid tolerance. There is this substance called ibogaine. It's also a hallucinogen, but it turns out that if you take it in very small dosages together with a painkiller, it can actually reverse the tolerance to that painkiller, and you may be able to get the same level of pain relief with just 10% of the dose you were taking before, and you don't have any of the side effects you had before, and the pain relief comes back. So essentially that type of a thing where like, hey, we wouldn't just be putting out a new painkiller, we would be putting out a completely new paradigm, which is removing tolerance to painkillers. It's kind of a completely new approach. I would count that as like, part of like the full success story of what we're doing is, okay, assume like in 15 years and 20 years, there's no more drug tolerance because that is a solved problem. That would be something I would count as a success. But then there's also kind of in the positive front, because not only are we trying to get rid of the most intense suffering, with the consciousness lens, all of a sudden also you get highlighted the most incredible senses of well-being. And essentially the feelings of well-being can go way higher than anybody can imagine. And examples of that are like MDMA or ecstasy, as is often called, or 5-MeO-DMT in terms of drugs. And in terms of meditation, there's like things like jhanas, extreme levels of well-being, loving kindness meditation in very high doses, also extreme sense of well-being. So essentially, we would love to bring technologies that allow people to experience these safely and reliably. So imagine something like a drug or an intervention that allows you to feel like you're on MDMA every day, like MDMA, like coffee. Imagine, rather than coffee, you drink this new substance, makes you feel like MDMA 4 hours a day, just no tolerance, no neurotoxicity. I think that is the kind of like radical improvement to the quality of life that we would actually hopefully get out of this.
Right. You don't mind if I probe into this a little bit deeper, do you?
No, go ahead.
So I asked you the question of what is the ultimate product? And you mentioned intense suffering. And then you gave the example of cluster headaches and chronic pain.
Yeah.
As in that's physical suffering. And you also mentioned psychological suffering. And you're going to help with well-being. So are you suggesting then that we take psychedelics to treat this intense suffering?
Right now, DMT, which is a
15 years from now.
15 years from now, probably not. Like,
is that the product? Like, I'm just curious. Like, okay, I have intense suffering, I have severe anxiety, I'm suffering, I'm fearful, I'm anxious. How are you going to help me?
Yeah. So actually, psychedelics are like really significant for many reasons. For the application of reducing intense suffering, I think it's kind of more of a coincidence that these are psychedelics. Like, the reason I think so is because there's also some non-psychedelic substances that have similar pain relieving effects. There is one called BOL 148, which is a non-psychedelic analog of LSD. And that one also prevents cluster headaches and is not as good as DMT. I think like DMT is especially effective and especially good because you can get rid of the cluster headache within minutes as opposed to having to wait a half an hour or an entire hour. But essentially this tells us that the therapeutic action of these molecules is orthogonal to their psychedelic effects. So all I'm actually suggesting, or I mean, really I'm pointing out is like, hey, these substances already work for this purpose, but most likely we will find analogs of these substances that will not be psychoactive, but they will still have these pain relieving effects. Or in the case of ibogaine, the wonderful anti-tolerance effect. So it would be something like, rather than taking like a standard opioid or like, you know, a benzodiazepine for anxiety, which I generally, I think it's a terrible idea. You would be taking a combo of a non-psychoactive but anti-tolerance drug together with something that does the direct therapeutic action. So it would be something like an anti-anxiety medication together with an anti-tolerance drug for that anti-anxiety medication. And that combo would be something that would reduce your anxiety with no habituation or like no addiction potential because you don't build tolerance to it, essentially.
Right. To me, that raises a lot of questions. For example, like if we have intense suffering in the form of physical suffering or psychological, to me, it seems like it's necessary to find out what is the root cause in the first place. Why is there chronic pain? Why is there anxiety? Why is there fear? And I feel like unless we address the fundamental issue, it's not really going to be a very sustainable solution. So for me, it seems like the real question is to identify what is the root cause in the first place and to perhaps examine, can we be free from anxiety 100%? Or can we be free from fear 100%? Or can we be free from chronic pain altogether? To me, it seems like it's worthwhile to pursue the root cause of these things in the first place. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, we can broadly cluster kind of like states of ill-being in two categories. One which would be functional as like a useful signaling mechanism, and non-functional, which is essentially where the system is in some sense like doing something that is just generating a lot of negative sensations without like a corresponding like signal of lack of functionality. So most cases of severe chronic pain, they have much more to do with the second cluster, where, for example, there's this whole cluster of neuropathic pain. There's nothing physically wrong with you. It's just that the neural networks are going haywire. They have like reached an attractor state that just causes a lot of dissonance. They're very unpleasant, but they're not actually signaling there's anything wrong with you. Like another example I could give you is a phantom limb pain. You know, if they cut your arm, you don't have an arm, you may nonetheless hallucinate that you have an arm and experience intense pain in that arm. Obviously, you don't even have an arm, right? Like obviously the pain is hallucinated. It doesn't refer to anything real. In that kind of situation, really, I would struggle to find a reason to keep that sort of pain, right? Like it's not telling you anything real or significant or important. It's not helping you avoid harm. In practice, is usually doing the opposite, right? Like, I mean, if you look at something like the rates of alcoholism in people who have chronic pain, they're huge, as well as, you know, rates of suicide, the rates of depression, anxiety, antisocial behavior. And that is because, hey, actually, if you are miserable all the time, you make really poor life decisions in general, right? So here's a case where like, not only is the pain not telling you anything significant, it's actually just making you make much worse decisions in general, which, you know, I would say like most of the bad suffering is in that category. Is like, hey, it's completely useless. It's not signaling anything useful. But then, yes, there are, or you could say like some functional, useful states of negative valence, negative sensations. My overall suspicion is that it's still also possible to have a perfectly wonderful life, very functional and loving, even altruistic without those as well. And there are proofs of concept for these. So one very stunning example is this woman called Jo Cameron. She's currently like 70 years old. She's a school teacher, vegan. She happens to have like a mutation in a gene that's called FAAH that essentially prevents the breakdown of anandamide, which is a very similar to cannabis. Actually, it's kind of like a cannabinoid substance or neurotransmitter, and essentially that makes it so that her pain is extremely mild in every circumstance. So, for example, she described childbirth as just a tickle, like she almost didn't feel it, and that she can eat Carolina pepper, an extremely hot pepper, and she will say like, yeah, it's kind of like warm and glowy, but there's no pain. And she's a perfectly wonderful woman. Like she's altruistic. She really cares for the kids that she teaches. There's really no sign of like anything problematic with her in any way. And she's never felt sad or depressed or have anxiety throughout her life. Which of course like makes us ask like, well, if you can be functional without, suffering, why did we evolve to have it? A lot of it, I think, can be traced to kind of like, we used to live in a particularly hostile evolutionary environment where actually, being paranoid and sad and depressed made a lot of sense. And also we are social creatures. Like one interesting finding, I haven't seen if this has been like kept up or haven't kept up with the literature, but as far as I remember like diving into these like a few years ago, the only creatures that get depressed, the only animals that get depressed are social animals. And there's like a reason why, and that is that one of the functions of getting depressed is so that you don't try to kind of like challenge the current hierarchy of your society. So if you're kind of like competing for the top spot of your tribe, but you're not actually the strongest of your tribe, that's a very, very dangerous place to be in, because they may actually kill you if they see you as a competition. So a lot of kind of like the depression and anxiety behavior that we have can be understood as like signaling a kind of like psychological submission. You're kind of like signaling that you're not going to fight, that you kind of like accept your position in society. I mean, it's really, really sad if you think about it, but that seems to be like one of the evolutionary functions of depression and anxiety. And I think like, nowadays, hopefully we advance to a more egalitarian society. We don't need that kind of, mood enforced sense of social hierarchy. I think it's hopefully we can move past that.
So I guess, are we ultimately concerned about how do you relieve human suffering? Is that our fundamental problem? Or what is our fundamental problem?
Oh, it's broader. I mean, I would say, at least as far as I am concerned.
Okay, if it's broader, what is that?
How do we relieve suffering in general, including non-human animals as well? I mean, if we had like a utopia, quote unquote, utopian society, everybody is very happy and motivated, but we still have, factory farms with, 100 billion pigs trapped in horrible suffering. Yeah, that wouldn't be a good world.
But can I just, for example, like that's all human created. In the wild, so when you say relieve suffering at large, you don't mean wild animals, because you mean the animals that we directly inflict suffering upon from humans.
I mean wild animals as well. Yeah.
Wild animals. Well, how do we know wild animals are suffering? And why are we concerned about them?
It's a scientific question. I mean, it is a scientific question. I mean, ultimately, I think any really good theory of consciousness will be species agnostic, right? Like, I mean, just as like a good theory of physics, good physics doesn't just describe how a person moves. Good physics describes how planets move, right? And what happened in the beginning of the beginning of the universe. ideally, your physics also tells you what happens in the tiniest of scales and even in a black hole. In our vision, a good theory of consciousness is something you can take, and yes, you can point it to a human, and it will tell you, okay, this person is in a state of bliss or is in a state of suffering, and this is the qualia that they're having, just based on like what's going on in their brain, what kind of like field behavior is happening. But also, a good theory of consciousness, if it's actually scientific and correct, is something that you should be able to point at everything. Point at a computer, point at a black hole, point at an ant in the wild. And that's one element. And the other thing too is that every point in reality is equally real, right? Like the principle of relativity is not like human experiences are more real somehow than the experience of a zebra, right? Like they're potentially one of them. I mean, the texture of experience is different, but they're both part of reality. And to the extent that they have valence, they both matter. So here I would, essentially use the phrase of Spider-Man or something like, essentially Uncle Ben, like with great power comes great responsibility. And essentially, with power comes complicity as well. And it's kind of this thought experiment that like, yes, if you see a cat that doesn't belong to you, that is like about to fall from a cliff, and you can just catch it, like, why wouldn't you do that? It may not seem, like we're responsible for the suffering in the wild. And, arguably right now, there's relatively little that we can do. But ultimately, with the technologies of the future, essentially, it will be a matter of choice, whether we keep wild animals suffering or not. And if we have good theories of consciousness, we will actually be able to quantify precisely, hey, like, this is the amount of suffering that lions are causing to zebras by eating them alive. We could plot all of them on a huge chart and essentially have kind of a map of suffering in the entire world. And I think, chances are humans are probably not the entities that suffer the most, would be my suspicion. I have like strong theoretic reasons to believe that probably other species actually suffer. There's some species that probably suffer much more than humans. And all of a sudden, they would actually become an ethical priority.
Okay. This raises a lot of questions for me. For example, I may be wrong about this, but it does seem to me that humans create suffering for other humans, and they also create suffering for other life forms, more so than wild animals. So to me, it seems like the fundamental issue is to address the human problem. And then when it comes to it seems to me that humans are causing the most suffering to other humans and to other animals and to plants and to everything in general. So for me, it seems like the fundamental problem seems to be the human mind. I may be wrong about this, but it does seem that is the case.
I think I suspect you're wrong. And it's essentially a matter of like looking at the statistics of like who actually lives in this planet. I would say, in terms of like what suffering humans are causing, I would say probably the bulk of it would actually not be to other humans, but it would be animals in factory farms. Like that is a crazy thing, but
sorry, that's what I mean as well. Yes, of course.
Yeah. So that's a huge source of suffering, enormous. Like unbelievable. Not to make comparisons, but it's like something like we have like hundreds of Holocausts, happening all the time because of factory farms. And eventually, I think like there's gonna be a cultural revolution when we have in vitro meat universally available. Essentially, everybody's gonna become a vegan, and we're gonna, I think it's gonna be a phase transition. People will realize, oh my gosh, our ancestors were really horrible for keeping all those animals in factory farms and so on. Yes, and for sure, like that is what we should be focusing on today. But from the bigger picture, depends on, for example, like how conscious insects are. But if it actually turns out, let's say, just to give one possible, number to this, imagine that the suffering that a beetle experiences, let's say, is even like 1,000th of the suffering than that a cat can experience, or something like that. If you have that kind of ratio, for sure, the bulk of the suffering in the world is insect suffering. And in which case, actually, yeah, preventing insect suffering may be the most important ethical task that humans have at hand, which is haven't gotten to that part of the plot yet. I mean, think about it, like the vast majority of insects, I mean, it's like an R reproduction strategy. Most insects essentially create like 1,000 offspring, out of which only one of them will get up, end up going to adulthood and reproducing. Most insects are either eaten alive or die of starvation or asphyxiation from a very young age. So essentially, from the point of view of consciousness and suffering, insect populations are enormous sources of suffering. Of course, yeah, it depends on how much credence you assign to insects having consciousness. But even without that, I would suspect, yeah, if you add up all together the bat suffering out there, the rodent suffering out there, the small fish suffering out there, yeah, it probably outweighs whatever suffering humans are causing by quite a lot, probably orders of magnitude.
Right, but I don't know. I'm not a beetle. I'm not an ant. I'm a human being.
Yeah.
And well, we could focus our energy on, I see your point, that if you look at the, level of how much suffering can we relieve, but are we forgetting our own, are we to focus on insects and blades of grass and everything else? Or are we to address human suffering and the disorder within humans and the disorder that humans create on nature, on insects, on the outer world? Surely to me, that seems more fundamental, because nature, I don't know if it needs our help. It's doing its thing. It's just that I do feel that humans are creating the disorder within nature, and nature has order in itself, but it's the humans that are creating the disorder. A disordered human mind will create disorder outwardly.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a fairly common view. I would say, I mean, first of all, it relies on two things. One is kind of like a narrow conception of morality or ethics, which has to do with something like, if I'm not touching it, I'm not responsible for it. This kind of like a avoiding blame. It's like, well, okay, if I have something to do with these, maybe it's my responsibility. If I didn't cause it or create it, then it has nothing to do with me. I'm not responsible for it. Which I would say, like, that's not really, if you look at ethics to the ultimate conclusions, if you can help, maybe you should help. But then the other perspective is a rosy picture of nature. I mean, the way I see nature might be depressive, but I think is realistic, is essentially a gigantic series of disasters, one after another. The idea that nature is like finely tuned and finely balanced, I think is, very much of a rosy glasses view of the world. Actually, species are coming online and going extinct all the time. There's parasitism, predation. From the point of view of a zebra being eaten alive, it's not like feeling like I'm participating in the circle of life and like that makes it good or something like that. It's like, no, it's actually just intrinsically horrific and there's no redeeming factor to it. And ultimately, there is no such thing as kind of like human consciousness. I mean, as I was telling you, like, okay, humans have minds, and like we're a special kind of set of experiences that are really good at information processing. We're very smart. We can reason, but that is not the source of value. The source of value actually is whether the experience feels good or bad. And you can have like very intense experiences of suffering or of happiness with very little cognition, with very little thinking going on. So the fact that we can verbalize, our experience, we have like cognition, almost doesn't touch the fact that we can feel happy or we can suffer. And so within this view, if a cow is suffering, the quality, the texture of that suffering is probably not very different than the quality of human suffering. It's just that human suffering has a thin layer of verbal cognition on top of it, but that doesn't really modify the essence of it. So that's one thing. And in addition to it, there really isn't like a hard boundary around humanity that you could say like, okay, these are humans, everything else is non-human. Species themselves don't have hard boundaries. A very simple proof of concept of this is what's called a ring species. Have you heard of a ring species?
Nope.
Okay, so this is in some islands, sometimes you will have some species of birds, for example, where the birds in one island can reproduce with the birds of neighboring islands, but they cannot reproduce with birds that are in very far away islands. However, you can connect, the islands that can reproduce with each other, and they will form a circle, or they will form kind of a network. In other words, A can reproduce with B can reproduce with C, and so on. And at some point it connects to like Z can reproduce with A, even though A cannot reproduce with like P or M, so that tells you that this idea that a species is, a set of individuals such that each of them can reproduce with each other, that definition obviously doesn't work because you have, what are called ring species. And I think the bigger insight is that there's actually no boundary between one species and the next. It's all a continuum. So the idea that like, well, we're responsible for humans, or human suffering is the one that matters, or maybe what humans cause is what matters, kind of assumes an essence to humanity. There's kind of like, a fundamental human nature or something like that. And I would argue that that doesn't exist. There's no such thing as humanity, at least from a fundamental point of view.
Sorry. I want to be clear on that point.
Yes.
What I meant. What I meant by disordered mind. Anything that I do out of an attachment is going to create limited action. Anything that I do out of fear is going to create a limited action. Anything out of a need or greed or a need for power, I'm going to not consider the whole. And to me, it seems like if we act in the world out of fear, out of anxiety, out of guilt, out of all these, to me, that's the disorder. We're going to breed more and more of it. For example, like obviously, like you gave the example of causing suffering to animals that's directly inflicted by humans by caging them up, by giving them the wrong kind of environment to live in. Like that's all human created suffering that isn't necessary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. That is a huge cause of suffering. I would add though that another big cause of suffering would be, in this context, incorrect models about consciousness. So take, for example, like Descartes, French philosopher, forget the precise century, but like way back in 1500s, 1600s, he believed that animals didn't have an inner subjective world, like that they were automatas, they were robots without consciousness. And he derived that based on religious ideas, like, well, humans have souls but animals don't. He went as far as to, for example, torture cats just in order to signal how much he believed in that idea. And I don't think he did that out of fear. I don't think he did that out of greed.
That was confusion.
It was confusion, or lack of.
I include that in the disordered mind category.
Okay. So I would then argue that if you have the ability to prevent suffering that you didn't cause or is unrelated to you, but you're not doing it, that would be also perhaps like maybe a disordered mind. So when we get to the point in the future where we have all the technologies to essentially tackle suffering in wild animals, it would probably be a symptom of a deranged mind if we don't do it. It would just let it happen.
You see, to me, it raises the question of why are we concerned about animals if we haven't addressed our own problems first?
I mean, I would say our own problems would be a priority. I should obviously I would have to qualify that quite a bit, but yeah, I mean, essentially, I very much buy into it's important to have your, your own kind of like pocket of reality in order, before you can fix everything else. With a caveat, which is that you really have to kind of like be committed to help all beings from the beginning, because otherwise you're essentially going to value drift. So there are worlds, possible worlds, and actually quite likely worlds where, for example, superorganism like the current version of China wins, where, for example, it might become like a completely authoritarian world, absolute surveillance, where, actually maybe people don't suffer very much, but institutionally and culturally, animals are considered as automatons and as robots, in which case, like pigs in factory farms, nobody will care about them because they will not even believe they're conscious. So I think like some kind of like ethical commitment from the very beginning to say, hey, once we actually fix our own neighborhood and so on, we will actually go on and try to help others. I think it's important. I'll also mention, I mean, you were saying kind of fear, greed, need for power, and so on. As I see it, there's essentially like some wisdom traditions, advanced stages in Buddhism, for example, or Buddhist monasteries. They have like very, very little suffering themselves, right? Like they may actually have like applied these techniques very rigorously, and they have like very, very little psychological suffering. And they're still motivated to help all beings, right? Like they have kind of eliminated their own suffering, but they still have kind of this desire to help all sentient beings, and the Buddha, or kind of this loving kindness as kind of a goal, has the aspiration to help all sentient beings. It's just that, back in the day, there really was no possible conception of a technology that could actually help, wild animals. It was just kind of like a desire, a wish. But with tomorrow's biotechnology, we will be able to do so. And so actually something like a Buddhist ethic would suggest, we also have to expand it to other sentient beings as well.
For example, you mentioned the Buddhist view, but it is the case that Buddha, or if there was a Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, whatever, understood what is suffering. Would you agree that he spoke, he taught people, and that's how Buddhism arose, out of his teachings? And he did this without technology. Well, we actually don't know how he did this, but is there not a possibility then in being able to relieve human suffering just by understanding what is suffering in the first place?
It can help a lot. And I mean, I would say the Buddhist ontology has some really good models for quite a bit of suffering. It doesn't have a fundamental model, and it's definitely not like mathematical. They're not trying to find the differential equations of pleasure and pain, which is what we're trying to figure out. So it's fairly approximate. And also there's a very big confusion usually, which I discusses the confusion between a recipe and a review. So one thing is to describe, let's say, a meditation technique. And another thing is to describe the effect of that meditation technique. Often they get conflated. So for example, there's like some meditation techniques, they're all about dissolving the sense of self. And they might say like, oh, there's no self, nobody's experiencing this, the experience doesn't belong to anybody. I would consider that that's a recipe. The output of that is something like what's called a Buddhist fourth path, which is like a state of consciousness that has no center. Well, in some sense, there's still consciousness. Consciousness did not disappear, but the shape of it has changed dramatically in such a way that now there's a lot less asymmetry, and there's a lot less dissonance in those configurations. And so I think like if Buddha was alive today, and had a bit of a scientific mindset, he would probably be thinking, well, yes, one thing is like the practice, the technique that takes you to a particular state of consciousness. A different thing is like the mathematics of that state of consciousness. And like I think the true the more full explanation of like what is suffering will be more in the mathematics of it, whereas the recipe is just kind of a hack. It's like, hey, how do you interact with this nervous system in order to rewire it in a helpful way? It is very much the case that, essentially with these kind of models, you can dramatically reduce suffering, but it's important to not romanticize it, because, even the Buddha himself, or Siddhartha, late in his life, he actually suffered from severe chronic pain. And he actually said that when it got like particularly bad, there was nothing that he could do to relieve it, not even like meditation. And so like it's just not true that like quote unquote enlightenment completely gets rid of suffering, because if pain is sufficiently strong, it's still there. I mean, we also know this from for example, Daniel Ingram, who's a very advanced meditator. He wrote a book called Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, and he says most kinds of physical pain he can endure with no problem. Like his meditation has actually significantly reduced the suffering that pain causes. But if he gets kidney stones, that's like pain so bad he still suffers from that. I mean, essentially it's such a powerful pain, it cuts through any kind of meditative attainment that he has achieved, and he's still suffering quite bad. So essentially, even Buddha would benefit from painkillers and opioids and anti-tolerance drugs, and essentially that kind of technology is not going to completely get rid of it.
Sorry, apologies. When I meant suffering, I meant psychological as opposed to physical, because there's a distinction there. Of course. But even if we take the example of physical suffering, like whether it's chronic lower back pain, which seems to be a common one, whether it's, like you said, chronic headaches, and so on, surely it's important to discover why they occur in the first place. And then perhaps if we can use drugs as an intervention to ease the pain and everything else. But do you see my point? Surely it's more important to discover why is that pain there in the first place? Could it be a result of some anxiety that I have? Could it be a result of some worry that I have? Could it be a result of the wrong kind of food, the wrong kind of posture at work? Could it be a result of money problems? Like to me, it seems like it's important to discover the actual root of something, and to see if we can address it at the root.
Yeah, for sure. In general, yes, of course, that's ideal if you can figure out the cause and address it at the root. At the same time, a lot of these things have, for example, genetic causes, which you may not be able to really fix. For example, cluster headaches seem to have quite a bit of a genetic component. And also like kidney stones, right? Like, I mean, a big percentage of kidney stones come because of like poor diet. You drink a lot of Coca-Cola and essentially eat the wrong food, a lot of oxalates, red meat, and so on. You're much more at risk of developing kidney stones. But then there's like a percentage of people who actually are just born with genes that predispose them to kidney stones, to such an extent they have kidney stones from the age of 5 and things like that. And in that case, probably the proper medication is is the way to go, even if you don't know what's wrong.
But even if somebody was born into a genetic problem and it's purely genetics, but even if we go deeper than that, for example, when there was the Chernobyl disaster, there's certain people born with defects after that disaster. And that was a result of nuclear waste being on Earth and destroying our soils, destroying our air and everything, well, destroying nature in general. And that was the direct cause of those defects, you could say. And perhaps if we just kept going back and back and back, we could even address that. I don't know if that makes sense as a question, but do you know what I'm saying? Like, for example, I'm aware that our soils are not in great shape in general. And that seems to me like an important question to address, to ensure that we all eat good, healthy food, to ensure that we clean air, to ensure that we don't have any nuclear waste for no reason spilling onto, our soils and air and so on. And that seems to be human related.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I mean, at the same time, we also have vaccines, and we also have, I mean, there's like a lot of things that were kind of like natural, part of the natural balance back in the day, but were like enormous causes of suffering. And also, the thing I was mentioning about I think it's called the status theory of depression, or the hierarchical theory of depression, where, again, like the reason why we may get depressed is so that we don't fight. Not in the sense of like that we're not aggressive, but like we don't have ambition, because in some tribal settings, having ambition is very dangerous. That sort of indicates that, like, hey, like a lot of our mental illnesses and problems predate civilization, and they're just, evolutionarily adaptive. They are good at reproducing our genes, but they're like just bad from an ethical or personal standpoint. Meaning that, like, in some cases, actually, we want to disrupt the natural order if it is actually the thing that was causing the suffering, if that makes sense.
Sorry, say that again, so I understand you.
Well, I get the impression, maybe I'm mistaken, that you're coming at it maybe a little bit with kind of like a perspective where a lot of our problems, a lot of our suffering comes because of disrupting the balance of nature, or kind of like not being mindful of the effect that we have on nature. And of course, a lot of the suffering does come from that, undeniably, whether it is like pollution or microplastics, or hormonal disruption or climate change. Of course, a lot of it is kind of like human driven in that sense. But then there's also a lot of suffering that you could say is, well, this just exists because it's evolutionarily adaptive in a context that we don't live in anymore, such as I was saying, like kind of like the status theory of depression, where the reason why in a tribal, pre-civilizational setting, something has been happening for hundreds of thousands of years, the reason why we get depressed is that if you're not actually the strongest person in a tribe, but you believe that you are the strongest person in a tribe, you're going to get killed, right? Like you're going to be killed by the alpha of the tribe. So it's actually better if you get depressed and keep your head down and don't try to challenge the order, because at least in that case, you may at least have like 1 or 2 kids as opposed to 0. Does that make sense?
So you're suggesting that is the only reason why we're depressed?
Oh, it's not definitely the only reason. There's also other reasons, much more having to do with like medical problems, but that is one reason where it's not because of poor health. Is just an evolutionary adaptation to maximize the spread of our genes, or essentially preventing us from like doing risky social decisions that can make you an outcast.
So what are we to do about it?
Well, yeah, for that sort of thing, I would say changing ourselves with, whether it is like meditation or any other consciousness technology. I think we can overcome that. I mean, like there might be like, if you think about it. So here's one example. Like one often reported effect of antidepressants is that essentially people are less afraid of like speaking up in work, for example, which tends to be good. Like if everybody can share their opinion in a meeting, people are not afraid of looking dumb, for example. That benefits everybody, right? Like you're actually bringing more information to the table. And people who used to be very depressed and for whom antidepressants actually work because of good luck, let's say, all of a sudden they find themselves, they can actually speak up at work. They actually are kind of like not as submissive as they were before. That's a fairly common experience. Now, again, I'm not suggesting everybody should take antidepressants in general or anything like that, but I am suggesting that if we can overcome kind of these evolutionarily adaptive submissive behavior, as it were, chances are we will actually also improve our communication and our kind of like overall collective behavior, the information processing that we do as a group, even though we would be risking looking more dumb in a group.
Right. So I'm just exploring here, but if I look at depression, anxiety, fear, or even suffering, psychological suffering, it does seem to me that all these things are thoughts in some shape or another. It's all a result of thinking. Without thinking, there is no fear. Without thinking, there is no anxiety. So, would you agree? Or
No.
no? Okay.
I mean, there is the pattern of excessive rumination in anxiety and depression, and
Sorry,
it is
what's that word? Sorry, what is it?
Rumination.
Okay,
Is,
what does that mean?
that means you're kind of like obsessively going over and over like something that is wrong. For example,
But that's
you have like
thinking.
yeah, for sure. Like I'm saying, like that's very common in depression and anxiety, and is definitely can reinforce the problem. But it's not neither necessary nor sufficient, because you can have like a lot of like thinking, even obsessive thinking, while having a really good time. For example, there's like some people who are like,
Of course.
yeah, so essentially you can have like that. But then the other thing too is that the worst kinds of suffering, including things such as like thinking of a panic attack as kind of like an extreme version of anxiety, they actually tend to be very thin on cognition and reflective self-awareness. Like blind panic, you're trying to run away from a fire, your building is on fire, you're trying to run away, you're not really thinking at that point.
But that's not anxiety.
I would say that's an extreme version of anxiety. Like that's
That
like
not be classified as an instinctual fear, or it's an instinct. Like an animal does that too. When a deer crosses the street and there's headlights, it moves away. It's in shock.
Well, anxiety is a texture of experience, right? If you introspect on what anxiety really is essentially kind of this irregularity in your bodily sense, where there's constantly a lot of like tiny prediction errors that are bubbling up to the surface. Like it's very common.
What does that mean? What does that mean? Tiny predictional. What does that mean?
Yeah. Okay, so contrast. This is related to like the valence structuralism and like the shape of your consciousness determining the valence. So if you're in a really good mood and you're calm, oftentimes like focusing in one point is very easy. Like meditating is very easy when you're like a really good, really calm point. When you have a lot of anxiety, meditating is very difficult. Why? Because every time you try to concentrate on something, a sensation will bubble up and it will distract you. So it's very common, you will think like, well, my heart did something weird. Am I having a heart attack? Wait, my stomach is doing something weird. Wait, my throat. So your attention is going to be jittering from one place to another, and that disrupts the flow of awareness. What I would be claiming is that the thing that makes anxiety unpleasant is precisely the fact that it doesn't allow you to have a steady flow of awareness. It's creating these irregularities. And that is the thing that is unpleasant, not that you're thinking. Thinking is just kind of like correlated with that happening. In some sense, it's almost kind of thinking is a side effect of like that property of constantly being distracted by body sensations that then maybe you associate with your life circumstance or something else. But at its most basic, the thing that is unpleasant about anxiety is this disruption of attention.
So what do we do about it?
We can smooth out our attention. I mean, like that's one example where
What
like,
does that mean again? What does that mean?
yeah, so just to give you an example here, like if you take if you put on one of these like vests that we have done some research on that create like pleasant body vibrations that can actually kind of like steady your attention. So like before you were in a state of anxiety, you were constantly distracted by little sensations in your body. If you give you like a very pleasant vibration that comes in and out and it's very regular and consonant, that can steady the flow of your awareness. So you were first in kind of this like very jittery flow, and after the vibration, you're now kind of like in a steady, constant sense of flow, and that feels way better. And that's like a very, very direct way of addressing anxiety. In this case, it doesn't use like substances. It doesn't even use like thinking or reframings or anything. It's just just applying a very regular tactile pattern can do the trick.
And is that a solution for all of humanity? Is that the only solution?
No, but it's an example of the class of solutions I'm very interested in, which is essentially applying patterns to change the shape of your consciousness. It obviously will not work for example, like severe pain. Like severe pain, pleasant tactile sensations, they're just not strong enough to distract you from the pain. You may need something else. You may need to like numb the pain first or cancel it out somehow. But it is pointing in the right direction. Like you can also think of, for example, breathing exercises. There's if you've ever tried a Wim Hof meditation, so it causes like some like, I mean, there's explanations. So like, hey, Wim Hof works because it's anti-inflammatory or like increases the immune system or regulates the immune system, things like that. But no, just pay attention to the body vibrations that those breathing exercises give you. You will notice that it also like homogenizes and steadies your attention. And I think actually that is a very big component of the mechanism of action. You're raising the energy of all of your nervous system and you're letting it cool down slowly. And that kind of like smooths out all the pinches and imperfections and symmetry breaking effects that are in your nervous system. And that just makes you feel better over time. That paradigm is what we call neural annealing, where essentially you're getting rid of kind of this tension and imperfections with kind of like heat energy and then like cooling it down slowly. That like makes it more regular and symmetric over time.
It raises the question for me then, what is the default state of a human mind?
The default state, yeah, it depends on how you address the question. Like you could address that question kind of empirically or epidemiologically, like, hey, in the wild and in society, how do people feel from a moment to moment basis? Kind of like, what is the modal human? And it's probably not that bad. There's probably quite a bit of boredom, for example, but let's say no chronic pain or chronic anxiety or something like that. But also you can address it as like, hey, how does it feel like to be a human if you don't have anything going wrong with you? And with that definition, probably like very few people would meet that standard. But I would say it probably feels really great. And the sort of people who are acquainted with that would actually be like long-term meditators who are kind of have gotten rid of their conditioning, as it were, and I can actually feel what it's like to just be a human as an animal without kind of like, yeah, all of the additional thoughts and ruminations and anxieties that characterize a typical person. In that sense, yeah, like the default state of human is actually pretty great. Empirically, though, I would say, yeah, the average human would actually feel pretty bad, because if you take the average as opposed to just like the model, like, the 50th percentile, if you average out all the feelings, it's probably pretty bad, because the top 10% of people who suffer the most actually suffer quite a lot, if that makes sense. Like the extremes tend to be really, really extreme. So the average is actually probably pretty bad.
And to me, like, once again, the question comes up, what do we do about that?
Yeah, I mean, the ethical kind of lens that I suggest is prioritarian, that we essentially should prioritize preventing and curing the worst kinds of suffering, because they account for the majority of the suffering out there. I mean, I make like kind of like the strange claim that, yeah, if you could like cure the top 1% of people who suffer the most, you may actually have gotten rid of like more than 50% of all the suffering of humans. And even just getting rid of cluster headaches that we were discussing earlier, I suspect might get rid of something like 10% of all human suffering. And from that lens, actually getting rid of something like 80% of suffering is something we could do in like 20 years if we were like focused and want to make it happen.
But how does 1% relieving suffering for 1%, how does that percentage increase? You said 50%?
Yeah.
How does that happen?
Think about it this way. Look at the distribution of wealth in the world, right? So I forget the statistic, but it's something like, 40% of people in the world live like in extreme poverty. Or like there's like I really should know the statistic, but essentially it's like, the median person has like, what would you consider like live like close to poverty or in poverty. And then if you were to kind of like graph, a percentile of like income over like, from the 0th percentile to the 100th percentile, kind of like grows very, very, very slowly, and then it starts to grow really fast, and then it really shoots up, right? Like if you look at like the top 0.01% of the wealth of people, hey, these are millionaires, right? And then if you look at the top 100 most wealthy people in the world, they're all billionaires, right? And it's even more extreme, right? Like the top 10%, top 10 most wealthy are extremely wealthy, right? And you have statistics like, yeah, something like, I'm not sure exactly what's going to come out, but it's something like, the top 2% most wealthy of all humans has as much money as everybody else combined, right? Like there's something like that. I claim that is the same with suffering, that essentially the people who suffer the most suffer so much more than everybody else that it's like unbelievable. And essentially we can just help them. That is just going to be reducing probably the majority of suffering in humans. So in other words, they're like billionaires of suffering out there. I actually know several people in that category.
See, for me, I was thinking, like, I don't know what the world's population is now, but I think it's around 8 billion. Maybe it is 8 billion.
Yeah.
And
I think
if we take 1% of chronic pain sufferers and we cure them, but that's still only 1% of humans.
Yes.
But how does, like, it's the rest of the 49% are still suffering with chronic pain?
Yeah, but a lot less. I mean, we should still help them. I mean, like
right. So that's what you meant. You just meant like to relieve the highest form of suffering in terms of actual physical pain. That's what you meant.
And psychological pain. It just according to us and our models, the worst suffering tends to be physical or physically driven, by far. But psychological suffering can also be really bad. I mean, like it can be really, really bad, but you cannot match a cluster headache in terms of psychological suffering. Like even the worst depression, the absolutely worst depression, is not as bad as a cluster headache. And people who suffer from cluster headaches, they will tell you, oh yeah, I would rather have the worst depression than like be having a cluster headache. It's just so much more worse. And on top of that, very severe physical pain typically also comes with very severe psychological pain. Like they actually come together. And yeah, I mean, like another intuition pump is like, yeah, imagine you go to a summer camp and it's like 100 days. There's going to be 100 days of your summer camp. And they tell you, yeah, 99 of those days, you're going to have a pretty good time. Maybe you will feel a little bit sad in here or a little bit of pain here, but nothing too extreme. And then one of those days, they're going to torture you from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep, and they're going to torture you in the worst way possible. Should you try to improve, and they give you resources to kind of like try to make the summer camp better? Should you allocate the resources evenly across the days, or should you try to make the one day that is the most horrible actually a little bit less horrible? And I think, yeah, you should prioritize the day you're going to be tortured and try to prevent that one day, because it's just so much worse than everything else.
Okay, so so fundamentally, I guess in summary, we're concerned about relieving human suffering, physical and psychological. Sure. That's our concern, right?
I mean, at Qualia, again, like in the big picture is relieving conscious suffering across the board. But
conscious suffering, so including animals and so on.
Yeah, but practically, and in the next couple decades, yes, it's going to be mostly humans who are going to benefit from this.
Yeah, how are we doing for time? Because you said 2:30, right? So
yeah, we've got let's say like 5-10 minutes. Yeah,
5-10 minutes. Okay. Well, I think. Gosh, I think we'll perhaps finish up, because I want to be respectful of your time. But is there anything else? Is there anything that I can point to? Is there anything that I should? Any final comments?
Yeah, I mean,
where should people go to find you and so on?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the last, I guess, like object level topic I'll briefly mention is one way in which we are pretty unusual is that we also are fairly confident, at least in our organization, that digital computers are not conscious and cannot be conscious. So there's definitely a very relevant topic these days, as with from DALL-E to GPT-4. A lot of people are actually worried. Are these systems already conscious? Clearly they're able to understand some things. Clearly they're capable of having in some sense of the word, awareness. Maybe they have some level of awareness. But according to us, they actually still have like zero consciousness. There's nothing that it feels like to be a large language model. But getting this right is really important, because we might also be kind of like, at the edge of like catalyzing a completely new kind of avenue for things to go wrong, where like, hey, if we enslaved a bunch of pigs for their meat, is it the case that now we're going to be enslaving a lot of algorithms just in order to use them for our purposes? Again, I don't think so, but I think like getting that question right is really important. So if anybody's like curious to learn more about like the reasons why at Qualia Research Institute we don't believe that digital computers can be conscious, I recommend you check out an article called Digital Sentience Requires Solving the Boundary Problem. It's in qri.org, as well as most of our articles. You can also find my blog in qualiacomputing.com and my YouTube channel just by looking my name, Andrés Gómez Emilsson. You'll find it there. And yeah, if anybody is like curious to join the community, we have a Discord. You can find also in qri.org. a Facebook group, and yeah, follow me on Twitter. Pretty active there. As it turns out, it's actually pretty synergistic with the work. So yeah, thank you so much.
Andres, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Oh, likewise.
Thank you.